Hey everybody, I'm Tom from Helix. It seems hard to believe, but our new EP Bad Dream has already been out for a month, and I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank everybody who's checked it out so far. The response that it's gotten has been really positive, and the support you guys have shown has far exceeded anything that Mary or I ever expected. So thank you so much. If you haven't checked it out, head on over to helix.bandcamp.com and give it a listen. We hope that you'll like what you hear. We thought it might be fun to do some sort of behind the scenes, under the hood type videos about the making of some of these tracks for the EP. And one of the things I've always really enjoyed on YouTube is seeing videos of other producers and musicians working and kind of taking apart their projects and showing how those parts came together to form the finished track. And I thought that might be kind of a fun thing to do with one of our tracks. So I chose Slip, which is a track a lot of you guys mentioned as being a favorite. And it also happens to be one of the more complex projects on the EP, so it seemed like it would be good fodder for this sort of thing. So without further ado, let's check it out. All right, so this is the project file for Slip. And to preemptively answer a question I'm sure a number of you will have, the name of this DAW is Bitwig Studio. It's made by a small team out of Berlin, Germany. And I think the first version came out in 2014. So it's been around for a while. They just passed version 4.1. So it's not brand new, but compared to some of the OG DAWs like Pro Tools and Logic, Cubase, and even Ableton, it's kind of the new kid on the block. And the reason I like it is that the creators of Bitwig really studied other DAWs and found what works and what doesn't, and found ways that they could improve workflow, the layout of the interface, and that sort of thing. And it just really makes things much more efficient, at least for me. I find that I work much faster in Bitwig than I do in Logic, which is my other DAW that I use. And you know, when you are in that creative flow where you're trying to get an idea down, you really don't want anything slowing you down. And that's one of many things that appeals to me about Bitwig, is it really helps me work quickly without having any obstacles in my way. As I mentioned, I also use Logic Pro. That's the one that I've used the longest, but these days I'm almost 100% working in Bitwig. I'll use Logic for some vocal editing and audio editing, but for me, Bitwig just does everything a little bit smoother and nicer, and it's a much more future-forward kind of DAW. I always feel like Logic is still kind of playing catch-up with the other DAWs. And adding features that are kind of up to date. Again, it's a great, Logic's great, but for me, Bitwig is just, it kind of melds with my creative style a little bit better. So right now, everything looks nice and compact because I have things divided into groups. And if you've never worked with groups before and you're working with a DAW, I don't know what you're doing with your life, because they make life so much easier. Especially if you have projects that are full of tracks. You know, if you have 70, 80, 90, 100 tracks in your average project, they can become quite difficult to navigate, you know. So if you figure out that you need to add some EQ to your hi-hat or something like that, you've got to go through, you know, all 100 tracks or whatever to find that track that you're looking for. This way, if you have them categorized into groups, you at least can break down that group and know, okay, my hi-hat's going to be in my drum group. That's where I'm going to find this track I'm looking for. It's also great in terms of the mixing process. You know, if you get your groups, all the tracks within a group, sounding where they should be relative to one another, and you put your mix together and you listen to it and you're like, you know, this mix sounds great, but I wish the drums were a little bit louder. Then all you need to do is go over to your drum group, bring the volume up a little bit, and all those drum tracks are going to come up together real easy. It's not as much of a concern as it used to be, but it can also save you CPU, because you can apply effects to groups, and it will apply that effect collectively to all the tracks that are within that group. And a lot of producers like to do this. If you have, for instance, a drum track that's made up of samples from all over the place, as opposed to a full drum kit, by applying some compression to the group that the drums are on, it kind of glues things together and makes them seem like they belong to the same kit. And obviously, the other advantage there is that it can save CPU. If you're not applying the same effect to every single track within a group, but just one group, that's going to save you some CPU, which ordinarily isn't a huge concern, but if you have an older computer that kind of struggles to keep up with some of the modern plugins, it's a good way to kind of cut back on the strain on your computer's CPU. So I also use color coding with my tracks. Again, this just makes things visually easy to see where the parts are. You can use whatever kind of scheme you want to, but I use drums are blue, bass is orange, synths are purple, effects are gray, and vocals are pink or red. Again, little things like this that help you get your project organized and easier to navigate is going to make your life so much easier, especially when you get projects that have a ton of tracks in them, where it becomes a little bit unmanageable. Little tricks like using groups and color coding can really help you get organized and navigate your project a little bit easier. So I guess we'll start out by checking out the drum group here. And these are all the tracks that make that up. Somebody asked this when we did the live stream a couple weeks ago about what the influence was for the drums on this track. And it was the hip hop and pop producer Timbaland, particularly the stuff that he did in the late 90s with artists like Missy Elliott. He had a very distinctive drum programming style where he would often have, his kick and his snare running in halftime, and then there would be percussion, or hi-hats or something gluing things together that were playing at double time. And that contrast is really interesting and unique sounding, and that was something that I kind of looked to emulate here on this track, because I just think it's a really cool sound. So I'm just going to play this a little bit, and I'll stop it now and then just to kind of comment on some things here. We start off with just kind of a clapping rhythm. I'm going to solo this here so we're just hearing the drums. We've got this drum here. It's got that great springy spring reverb sound on it. One of the aesthetics that I really like using with Helix is sort of retro effects, like spring reverb or tape delay. They kind of give a little bit more character. There's nothing wrong with super clean, modern sounding plug-in effects, but I just think some of these old style effects really add character and interest to a track, and texture as well. So that's something that I make frequent use of with in Helix tracks. This is the main that's kind of the main your one and your two, your kick and your snare, and that's actually emulating the Timbaland snare sound too, which is just an acoustic snare drum sound, kind of a metallic one. And then I pulled the sample end for that. We look here, you can see this is the end of the sample. This is the entire sample, and this is the sample end. So it cuts off unnaturally, kind of like a gated reverb, but it's just kind of an interesting sound, and it's a sound that he used on a lot of his early things that I really dug. So I just kind of incorporated it in this track. So we have a ride that comes in here. And again, that's all the intro section. When things finally kick in, so things get a little bit more complex once the song actually kicks in. Ordinarily, when I'm working on a track, before the track has lyrics or before it has a theme or a name, I just kind of give it names that are descriptive so that it'll mean something to me when I'm going through all these tracks on my hard drive. And I think I called this one Slip because of these backwards cymbals, and there's also a backwards snare here, this timba drums bounce here. And it sounded like the rhythm was kind of slipping to me, like it's kind of simultaneously moving forward and moving backwards. So I just called it Slip as a reference so I'd know it when I saw the name, which track it was that I was working on. And I usually pass these tracks on to Mary after it's probably usually, the song is usually about 3/4 of the way done, just so that she has a feel for what the finished version is going to sound like. And she ended up using the provisional title I gave it, Slip, as the impetus for writing the lyrics, and indeed the actual title of the song that it ended up being. So yeah, so we have, these are our main drums here, and we've got this pre-reverb that kind of sucks up into it. If I go back over here, I also have this like a rim shot sound that has a tape delay on it. Here's a reverse cymbal. These are hi-hats. There's actually two different hi-hat lines. There's an acoustic hi-hat, and there's a kind of TR-808 hi-hat. And then there's this shaker part. The other thing I really like about this is this sort of rolling lo-fi tom loop that goes throughout. Just adds a nice dynamic to it. Things kind of expand a little bit more when we get to the chorus. That's a very common thing with songwriting. You're kind of modulating the energy of the track as it goes along. So you want your verses to be at a certain energy level, and you want your chorus to be a little bit more energetic, a little bit more impactful. So it stands to reason that that section is going to be a little bit more complex and thicker. And so there you can see there are some additional layers added in here. So we have this sort of subtle knocky beat in the background, and these sort of stompy kick. And an additional snare drum with a lot of reverb on it to kind of make it sound a little bit bigger and fuller. So that's a little bit of a look inside the drum tracks on there. I'm going to move on now to our bass group, which is this. Actually, let me go forward to the actual verse. So this is a bass sound from a hardware synth. This is my Moog Sub 37, which is a great bass machine. Obviously, Moogs are really well known for their bass abilities. One kind of unusual thing I've done here is I've split it into high and low components. So the low component, I'm filtering out the high end in it. So you're just hearing not a lot of high frequencies there. It's mostly subs and that sort of thing. And then I have this other half where we're just hearing the higher frequencies. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to add a little bit of chorus to it to kind of widen things a little bit. And in general, with bass, you don't want to have your low frequencies being in stereo. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that the human ear has difficulty discerning directionality when it comes to really low frequencies. So if you have stereo information on your bass track on those really low frequencies, you're kind of overcrowding your bass without it being really necessary. That's not really doing a lot of good. So I just wanted to apply this chorus, which is going to add some sort of stereo width to it, to the mid and high frequencies. So that way my my low frequencies of the bass are in mono, as they generally should be, and I'm getting a little bit of extra width out of this chorus sound in the high frequencies. So if we solo this, you can hear there's no low end to that at all. If I turn off the EQ, you can hear the original sound. And if I turn this chorus off, you can hear how that adds some stereo width to things. This is, I believe, Tal Chorus LX is a free plugin. Tal makes awesome stuff, and they have a lot of awesome free stuff that is just as good as commercial stuff, so I highly recommend that stuff. So yeah, that's mostly what's of interest there. I'm also on the low end here part, I'm adding Decapitator from Sound Toys, which is a really nice saturator and overdrive effect. It just adds a little bit of balls to the low end and makes things sound fuller. I also have Gullfoss on here, and this is it's really meant to be on your master bus, and I always put it on the master bus, but it actually works on individual tracks as well too. And it's hard to describe what it does, but it basically shifts harmonics in the sound to adapt to harmonics that are more pleasing to human hearing. So it's a very subtle effect, but it just kind of brings that extra 5% to your sounds that might be missing, and it just makes things sound that much better. And with mixing, so much of what you're doing are not these huge monumental changes that are going to change the way the track sounds, but they're these little incremental changes, and those incremental changes collectively add up to those bigger changes in the way that your mix sounds. So moving on to our synths group, yeah, we have this very cool backwards and forwards piano loop. And again, using tape delay on this. I used to be a big fan of Sound Toys Echo Boy. That was my delay of choice, but it doesn't always work so well with Bitwig these days. So I moved over to Valhalla delay, and I haven't really looked back. It offers a lot of the same types of delays, and it just works much better. And it's also super cheap. The Valhalla stuff is $50 a piece, and Valhalla delay is my go-to delay, and Valhalla Vintage Verb is my go-to reverb for the most part. We have this lead here, which is from Yuhi Diva, which is an amazing soft synth, one of the most authentically analog sounding plugins, I think, for synths. All right, so things pretty much stay very simple. We just have, when the vocals first come in the verse, we just have drums and bass and vocals. But again, as I mentioned before, when you get to the chorus, you want that chorus to have impact, to be bigger and larger sounding. So you can see all these different layers of synths that we have here. And I have kind of two levels of pad here. I have one that is just adding high frequencies and a little bit of texture, and that sounds like this. And then I have another one, and this is also another Yuhi synth. This is from a synth called Hive, which is a little bit more modern, digital kind of synth. And this is just to add stereo width and some lower frequencies. I'll layer that with a higher pad. So when you're layering, you don't want to just kind of layer things willy-nilly. You want to have a purpose to each layer. So like I said, with this high pad, this high pad layer is adding texture and high-end sheen to things, and this lower pad is adding the body and the stereo width to things. If you just start layering things willy-nilly, you might accidentally come up with something that sounds great, but you're going to have much better results if you layer with purpose and you know ahead of time why you are selecting the sound that you're adding. There's also a layer of sort of string machine type strings. So we'll add all these parts together. And you can hear distinctly when I'm adding each of those in, you can hear what they're contributing to the sound. And the nice thing about it is that because they're all in different frequency ranges, they're not competing with one another. So I don't have to do a whole ton of EQ to make this stuff work together. It just sounds great together because everything is living in its own space. So that's the main chordal part, is these 3 tracks here. There is also this is also from Diva. This is like a kind of FM modulated sine wave synth. So that sounds like that. And then we also have almost kind of a bell-like synth here playing this part. And that has also some interesting stereo movement going on too. So again, that makes things sound a little bit wider, a little bit more interesting in a stereo sense. So if we kind of play all these parts together, you can hear that everything kind of works together in harmony. Again, paying attention to the frequency content of each track to make sure that things aren't in the same octave or not having a lot of the same frequencies competing with one another, which causes a big mess that you got to EQ. If you just arrange your track intelligently, again, you'll save yourself so much time in the mix down process because you won't need to be reaching for all that EQ to make things work together. They're just going to sit together nicely. So let's have a listen to all that stuff together. So moving on, I think the only additional parts here is there's a string part that comes in during one of the final verses, kind of a violin part. Let me solo that out so we don't have all that other garbage going on there. Now, I'm going to play this with the rest of the tracks, but you'll hear, this is a very high sound, and everything else is kind of out of its way. So again, this is just using arrangement to make everything fit in its place without having to do a whole ton of EQ. And then during the chorus, I also added this string part here. Just adds a little extra just kiss of high frequencies that sounds really nice, adds a little bit of sheen to things. I should note that both of these tracks are from Spitfire Audio's BBC Symphony Orchestra, which is an absolutely free plugin that has really high quality orchestral strings, brass, percussion, that sort of thing. Again, you don't have to spend a lot of money to get really great sounds. And I have tons of commercial plugins and synths and stuff like that, but I don't really differentiate between the stuff that, maybe is really expensive or the stuff that is free. If it sounds great, then who cares? So that pretty much rounds out the synth parts here. We'll go into our effects sounds here. In the intro, this one isn't going to play back right because I'm using Little Alter Boy, which is another Sound Toys plugin. It's kind of a pitch and format shifter, and it doesn't really play very well with Bitwig, and it never has. And I wish Sound Toys would get their shit together and fix it, because I really like their plugins, but I can't really depend on them the way that I can other plugins. This was adding some modulated pitch shifting, so it just adds kind of a druggy, weird sounding effect where the voice is getting lower and higher as it goes on. But this is just kind of a garbled vocal thing. It's not really meant to be understood in terms of lyrics or anything. It's just adding an element of texture in there. And that's also going through a filter plugin here, which as time goes on, the filter kind of opens and closes. So again, just a textural element, something to add some interest. Likewise, I have this recording of a marketplace that is also being filtered. If I take these, you can hear this is the original sample. And when you're listening to this in the context of the song, you might not even notice it, but it's just adding a little bit of interest in there that I think sounds nice. And I'm a real big fan of texture in music. I think it's one of the things that I love about bands like Portishead or Boards of Canada. They add these sort of lo-fi elements that they don't sound high fidelity, but they sound great. They just sound interesting. They're full of character. In the same section, we also have there's some wind chimes. And I also have this sound, which is something I made in Reactor a long time ago. So again, it's all about just adding texture and adding some interesting sounds in there. One of the problems that we run into, with modern electronic music, especially when you're using a lot of plugins, is sometimes it sounds a little bit too perfect. And that has its purpose, but it doesn't sound quite as interesting as if you're using, an old analog synth that is, has its weird quirks and imperfections. So adding a little bit of that interest back into things, I think is really vital to making really listenable and interesting electronic music. So that we'll solo this out as the effects group. And you can hear it's none of this is musical. It's just sound, and it just sounds kind of interesting, at least to me. I also have here a reverse. There's a vocal part, and then I also have this reversed vocal here that I think the only other kind of effect sound here is during this breakdown later in the song. We have this little thing. It's just kind of a reversed synth sound, and I'm sending it through a bit crusher. Again, it's about texture, it's about adding grit and imperfections that kind of make things sound interesting. So that brings us to the vocals. And Mary is a real big fan of layering her vocals. And during the pandemic, because we had a lot of free time on our hands and nowhere to go really, she took some courses on vocal production and learned some new techniques in terms of layering. And this EP was the first time that we really got to kind of use those. So we'll look at the verses here first. And you can see she recorded 6 layers of vocals, but I didn't use 2 of those layers. And the reason for that is going back to what I mentioned before about wanting to manipulate energy between the sections of a song. So you want your verse to be a little bit lower energy than your chorus in general. There's exceptions to that, of course. So I didn't want to go balls out with this and have like the thickest possible vocal I could. So let's just solo this section here.
It's crawling, this feeling, something's coming, something's happening.
So you remember how I talked about how one of the advantages of groups is that we can process all the tracks in a group together? That's what I've done here, because I have all these layers together, and rather than have it come across as being multiple layers, even though it clearly is, I wanted it to sound like a unified vocal. So I did most of the processing for this all together in terms of I did some EQ where I just take out low frequencies that I don't need to keep my low end, my bass clean. And it's got a plate reverb, Valhalla plate, another amazing reverb. I can't recommend their stuff enough. It's so reasonably priced and it sounds so good, and they're constantly adding new features and free updates. And then at the end of that, I have this another free plugin from Slate Audio called Fresh Air, and it's just good for adding airy frequencies and presence to vocals. And in a thick arrangement like this, it really helps it kind of cut through. So
it's crawling,
we'll take some of these.
Feeling, something's coming, something's happening.
So here's how everything sounds by itself.
All around us, can you see it?
Taking out low frequencies there. When you solo something, you're going to hear, oh, that sounds a little bit tinny. That sounds like it's missing some of those low frequencies. When you're EQing, it's important not to make those EQ decisions when you're soloing a track. And the reason is that oftentimes the right EQ settings are going to sound off if you solo them. But in the context of a mix where you have all these other tracks that are contributing frequencies, those frequencies are going to be filled in by another track, and you don't notice that that information is missing. The only difference is that it cleans up some of that area, it makes a little bit more room in your mix. So then we have this plate here.
It's crawling, this feeling, something's coming, something's happening. The fabric all around us, can you see it? Of course not.
So you can hear how that fresh air adds some presence, and it just helps things cut through. Again, listening to it on its own, it's like, whoa, that sounds a little bit excessive. But in the context of the full mix, it just helps everything cut through and helps those vocals be heard.
It's crawling, this feeling, something's coming, something's happening. The fabric.
So one other thing I'll mention is that I used my dynamic effects, compression and so forth, on the individual tracks. And the reason I did that is it's a technique that I've used pretty much throughout my entire recording career that I haven't really heard other people doing. But I've selected one vocal as the main track. And I've got Wave's Vocal Writer here, which it's just kind of an automatic gain control. And it just kind of evens out the levels of the vocal a little bit as they go on.
It's crawling, this feeling.
And it just smooths things a little bit so the compressor doesn't have to work quite so hard when it gets to that compression stage. I generally don't recommend Waves plugins because their update policy is pretty heinous, and I just find the company has some sort of ethical issues that I'm not thrilled about. but I haven't really found a replacement for this one that works as well. So if you know of one, definitely shout out in the comments and let me know. So when we get to these two additional tracks here, you can see I have one that is panned to the right,
It's crawling,
and one to the left. But if you look at these individual tracks, you'll see there's nothing on there. There's no dynamics of any sort. There's no compression. That's very unusual. Usually with an instrument like vocals, you always want compression on it. But because I'm building a hybrid track here, I have the compression on my main vocal track to make that sound strong and even. And by not having the dynamics on these supportive tracks, what happens is that you get almost a dynamic doubling effect. So the kind of natural chorusing that happens when you're doubling a vocal isn't as audible on quieter notes, but when she sings a louder note, it kind of comes through, that chorusing effect comes through more clearly. And it's just, I think, a little bit more of a dynamic way of doing things. There is no, quote unquote, right or wrong way to do things, but this is a technique that I've used for a long time that I think just sounds just a little bit more interesting than if I just fed everything through a compressor and had everything coming through with the same sort of strength. So there are our vocal verses. Now, when we get to the chorus, you can see there's a lot more going on here. And again, with the chorus, we want the chorus to be more impressive and bigger sounding. So you can see I'm using all the tracks that she gave me here, and they're all panned out in different ways. And the other difference you'll see here is that all of these have dynamics on them. And that's because I want this part of the vocal to come through much stronger. And especially with the lyrics on this one, it was really important that the chorus has impact.
I don't think I know you anymore. I let you slip from the way you were before.
So that's another difference between the verse vocals and the chorus vocals. My chain is mostly the same here, except I've added some Valhalla delay to it, which wasn't on the other one. And also I'm using Isotope Nectar, and I'm mainly really just using it it's got this great EQ that kind of goes through and finds resonant frequencies in a track that might be somewhat excessive or annoying. And it kind of tames those a little bit. And also there's no compression on that. I'm just using it for the EQ effect on this. As time goes on, you can see Mary has added more layers. Again, this is all about having that energy kind of crescendo as the song goes along. So in this section, we have an extra set of harmonies.
I don't know how to love you anymore.
And that harmonies are a really great way of just kind of underlining certain parts of a vocal, and that's what she's done here. We have, without that.
Slip from the way you were before. I don't know how to love you anymore.
And we have this section here. This is actually a subgroup within this group. That's another nice thing that you can sometimes do. But I added this very extreme kind of EQ. It's almost kind of a telephone type effect. And I just wanted all of these different layers together to be processed together. So that was the easiest way to do that, by just making a little subgroup for those particular vocals. Then at the very end, we have a couple additional tracks here.
I want you slip from the way you were before.
So that's just kind of a quick look through the entire project of this. It's not really terribly complex in terms of the mix. If I look at the actual mix section here, these are all divided into my groups, but you can see there's not a ton of effects on most of the stuff that's going through outside of the vocals. And if you organize your tracks and you build your arrangement in a way where, as I discussed before, those parts aren't going to be competing with one another, you're going to find that you don't need as many plugins to kind of coax things into sounding good together. And I think that plugins and audio processing, I like to kind of compare it to spices in food, or you can think of it as like salt. Like a little bit of salt is going to enhance the flavor of anything that you cook with it and make it taste delicious. But if you add too much, it's going to make it a mess. So things that you can do, unless you're doing kind of sound design things, anything you can do to kind of reduce the amount of processing you have to do, I think is going to end up giving you a nicer sounding mix. And especially, for somebody like Mary, who's got a really great voice naturally, you don't really necessarily want to cover that up in a ton of effects. You just kind of want it to shine through in the arrangement. So anyway, that's a look inside Slip. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't, and pass it on to friends. And if this gets a good response, maybe we'll look inside some of the other tracks that we've done. If you have any questions, mention them in the comments, and I will try to address those. All right, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you next time.